Good evening, everyone. I'm Karen Sander, the Director of Public Programs for the CUNY Graduate Center, and we are so delighted to have you join us here tonight for what promises to be an important and lively conversation on a most timely topic. I would like to offer a welcome to those of you who are here in person, but also to our large online audience who are tuning in from across the country. One of the silver linings from the pandemic has been that people from around the world are now attending the CUNY Graduate Center public events, and we're really thrilled to have you as part of our audience. We hope to see all of you back at many more events this semester, whether here in person in New York City or online. Next week, there is an event on a new biography about the artist Pablo Picasso, and the following week, GC professor and New York Times columnist Paul Krugman will be in conversation with Speaker of the House Emeritus Nancy Pelosi. Tonight's program is part of the Graduate Center's project, The Promise and Perils of Democracy, which is supported by the Carnegie Corporation of New York. This event tonight is co-sponsored by our Ralph Bunche Institute for International Studies. Here at the CUNY Graduate Center, our students and faculty are regularly studying how historical forces are influencing contemporary life. Tonight, we will examine the current state of democracy in the US. We will look back at what forces in history brought us to this moment while analyzing our current situation. We have a terrific group of people to help us delve into these topics, and it is my great pleasure to introduce them. First, we have Jamelle Bouie, who is a columnist for the New York Times opinion section. Next, we have Corey Robin, who is a distinguished professor of political science at Brooklyn College and here at the CUNY Graduate Center. He is the author most recently of The Enigma of Clarence Thomas, and he's also a frequent contributor to The New Yorker and the New York Review of Books. And our moderator for the evening is Katrina Heuvel, who was the editor of The Nation from 1995 to 2019. Currently, she is the Nation's editorial director and publisher. She also writes a weekly column for The Washington Post. Before I turn the stage over to our distinguished panel, a quick note about tonight's format. Our panel will converse until around 7:30, and then we will open up for questions from the in-person audience until 7:45. You can use the mics that are here on the aisles to ask your questions. Katrina, I turn it over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Can you hear me? It's very good to be with you here tonight. We could just close it out with a yes or no, but we're not going to do that. We're going to have an interesting conversation. The Nation magazine was founded in this city in 1865. Its first line, the first line of the first issue was, "The week was singularly barren of exciting events." I have never had such a week, and this is not such a week. I thought we might be here on indictment watch, but we're here to begin with talk of history. We have two extraordinary commentators who know their history very well. And I think of someone you both know, Eric Foner, who's on our editorial board, esteemed historian who always likes to go back to the origins, as he puts it, of stuff. So how, briefly, both of you, how did we get here? I mean, how did we get here? I'm thinking not simply the Civil War. You write about the amendments emerging before and after, not simply the revolution, but in history, how did we arrive at this moment? March 22, 2023.
First, thank you to CUNY for having me here for this discussion. So I feel like part of trying to answer this question is trying to figure out what here is. And here is, I think, is a few things. First, it is the very palpable sense that our system of democracy isn't particularly democratic, that whatever the public wants, whatever sort of the majority of the public wants, isn't really expressed in our institutions in a meaningful way. I think part of what here is real dismay at how a distinct minority of the country has essentially captured some of the commanding heights of the American political system. And so, for example, as we all know, the Supreme Court can unilaterally overturn a precedent, the precedent in Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood v. Casey, and end constitutional protection of abortion rights and sort of open the door to really terrifying restrictions on people's bodily autonomy and freedom across the country. And there doesn't really seem to be a democratic recourse to that, right? Like, what's the democratic recourse to the Supreme Court? What's the democratic recourse to hyper-gerrymandered state legislatures, which are functionally unable to ever be moved? And so when you think about the origins of that, I do think you have to go back to the founding and understand the founders as, in part, you could say radically democratic for a particular set of men of their class and station, but also extremely suspicious of and hostile to democracy, or democracy that hasn't been structured and organized by counter-majoritarian institutions. And it's those counter-majoritarian institutions that come out of the moment of the Constitution. Well, we may talk about this, whatever, but parenthetical, there was, of course, a Constitution before the Constitution, the Articles, and it had its defenders in the moment, in the time before it was superseded. And its defenders argued that this was a much more democratic system for all its flaws than what the Constitution would produce. And the Articles were very flawed. I don't think those critics were wrong. And what I think we have been experiencing in an acute way over the past decade, maybe more, since 2000, is that Americans have a set of democratic intuitions, right? Things that we think are true about the way democracy should work. Whoever gets the most votes should win an election, for example. But we have a set of counter-majoritarian institutions that are in tension with those democratic intuitions, not just in tension with them, but can often subvert them in really profound ways. And so I think we're kind of running up against not the limits of that subversion, because I think that subversion can go pretty deep, but I think the moment we're in is a gradual recognition and realization that this isn't just a problem of political will, it's maybe just a problem of the basic institutions of American democracy.
Thank you. Corey.
Excuse me, so my voice is going, but thankfully the mic will project and gives me an excuse not to talk when I don't know the answer. But I mean, I agree with, and first of all, thank you all for coming, and it's great to see everybody here. I completely agree with what Jamelle just said, and I think it's a real one of the positive things about our current moment is that there, I think, is an increasingly widespread skepticism about the nation's founding institutions. When I was in graduate school in the 1990s, that was not really the attitude towards a lot of the founding institutions. And there's just been a sea change, I think, that really is trying to go back to that moment. And so I am 100% in agreement about that, and I think it's pretty much the way to go. There's one sort of addition I would make to that. So a typical counter-majoritarian institution is the Electoral College. And there was a great book written by Alex Kazar, who's a historian, called The Right to Vote, and it came out in 2000. And it was a really comprehensive book showing you all the abridgments and all the pushback against the gradual extension of the franchise. Very eye-opening. What's interesting about that book, which I said came out in 2000, it makes almost no mention of the Electoral College at all. And KSR was interviewed about this later, and he said, sorry, can people hear me? Okay. He said, the truth of the matter is I thought of the Electoral College as a kind of vote aggregator. It just added up the votes. I didn't think of it as in any way connected to the right to vote. And I think he had a reason for thinking that, which is that throughout the 20th century, it had not happened that a candidate would win the popular vote and lose the election. It had happened in the 19th century, but it hadn't happened in the 20th century. And now we're in 2023. It's happened twice in the 21st century. And to me, that is a story in part about the founding document and the institutional design, that it's kind of this incubus that has been lying there. But it's also a moment to reflect on, so what was it in the 20th century that prevented this from happening? I mean, there were very close elections in the 1960 election, the 1968 election, less than 1% vote difference. And I mean, I think there's a lot of different answers. One of them, I think, is the Cold War, which for all of its repressive effects at home, also had a strangely democratizing effect at home, because the United States was engaged in an ideological battle with the Soviet Union and international communism throughout the decolonizing world. It had to show that it stood for democracy, and I do think there's some sense in which, they could never let it happen on their watch, that the tyranny of the minority that you're talking about. Interestingly, you mentioned the Supreme Court in the 1960s under the Warren Court, when they did all of these one person, one vote, they called it one man, one vote, but all those cases that came out, there was a real palpable sense, and they make reference to the Soviet, to communism and the decolonizing world in those cases. And there was a real sense that we cannot tolerate a white majority subjugating a black minority. And all the more so could they not tolerate the idea of a white minority subjugating a multiracial majority. And that's the system that's where we are now. So this is just a sort of a long-winded way of saying, yes, the Constitution and the founding, but let's also be alive to the contingent changes over the course of the 20th century that had differential effects that would have made something to a historian like Alex Kazar. It would have just been inconceivable to him that we would be in the moment that we're in now.
Jamelle, did you want to?
Yeah, I just want to add one more thing to what Corey said about the end of the Cold War, because I do think that among historians, they talk about this all the time, but I think among the general public, it hasn't quite sunk in not just how obviously epochal the end of the Cold War was, but how important it was for structuring American politics, that it's probably not a coincidence that in the generation since the end of the Cold War, we've seen a resurgence of American nativism, American xenophobia, and an American left wing, right? We've seen a resurgence of ideologies that were quite strong prior to the Second World War, that had real public import prior to the Second World War, and were kind of pushed to the sides by this Cold War consensus by liberals and by conservatives, all sides trying to maintain something of a consensus. And I think part of the collapse and erosion of that consensus is the collapse and erosion of the idea that democracy is a positive good. To steal a phrase from a slaveholder, John C. Calhoun refers to slavery as a positive good, which it's obviously not. But that phrase, a positive good, I happen to like, so there you go. But there's this consensus that democracy is a positive good, and that's clearly not the case anymore. Was it Senator Mike Lee who last year or 2 years ago referred to democracy as, quote, rank democracy, right? Sort of like just outward contempt for the idea that the United States could become more democratic than it is. And I think we really should tie the emergence of these ideologies, or at least their resurgence in public view, to the collapse, the end of the Cold War and the collapse of kind of like the boundaries around that?
I don't believe the Cold War is over. I think there's a new Cold War, and this is not my panel, but if there was a through line in the nation's history, it's the belief that endless war does not permit a true democracy at home. And I'm not an isolationist, but I do believe we do better by getting our own house in order before we go out into the world to preach. But there's no question that in the 60s, for example, the fact that, say, the Children's Defense Fund, and there was a civil rights strategy of kids, using kids to highlight the brutality, was something. It also did organize our politics and gave a jolt to movements on behalf of governments, supported movements for reasons you're just describing, to look well in the world. But I do think we're in a different period, and I want to come to that in a little bit about how the rise of right-wing authoritarianism abroad and in this country are synergistic in a way. Supreme Court, briefly, you've talked about the anti-democratic institutions at the founding. It's interesting because there is an awareness now of how important the court is, and for so long, the left progressives didn't vote on behalf of the court. But the court, tell me if you agree, that the court, with the exception of the Warren Court, this court has not been on the side of the principles we might agree. I mean, Dred Scott, Lochner, 3 days in June 2022, Dobbs, Bruin, EPA versus West Virginia. So I'm just, how do you think about the court, and what are the remedies for that? Because before we end tonight, I also want to ask your solutions to the Electoral College, filibuster, et cetera. But the court, you wrote about Corey, you wrote about Clarence Thomas,
Yeah.
and you gave him a pretty good
I'm
review.
I'm not going to talk
And by
about
the way,
Clarence Thomas.
Bush v. Gore.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, again, because there's been, I think, a sea change among progressives in their attitude towards the court. And I think it's also generational, actually. I just think among people who are younger than my generation, it's much more intuitive that the Supreme Court is not the friend of freedom, which was not at all the case when I was growing up. There were still those tailwinds from the Warren Court that I think continued, up until rulings on gay marriage and all the rest of it. But I think there's two issues. One is the idea that the Supreme Court is the supreme interpreter of the Constitution. That was up until, again, the Cold War, actually, a very contested idea in American politics. Jefferson, Lincoln, FDR, they didn't, although they were careful not to, act against the court, they never accepted in public discourse and political discourse what both Dwight D. Eisenhower and John F. Kennedy said, which is, it is the job of the Supreme Court to interpret the Constitution and for us to accept the Supreme Court's ruling. That's a pretty recent thing. So I think the first thing we have to really try to unpack and get our heads around is what used to just be called a kind of either popular constitutionalism or interdepartmental constitutionalism, that we have a system where many different political actors and citizens are in a position to interpret the Constitution. And many of the great reforms of the progressive era, that wave of constitutional amendments or Reconstruction, that was on the wave of decades of popular agitation, of people reclaiming the definition of the Constitution from the court. And I think that's really important. And then the second thing I would say, because I think the first thing is probably a little bit less, not that controversial anymore. Willie Forbath and Joseph Fishkin had a book last year called The Anti-Oligarchy Constitution. And one of the, I thought, very persuasive arguments they made is that the real moments of constitutional reform, the big one is Reconstruction And then in the progressive era, there was, women's right to vote, income tax, reform of the Senate, and one other which I've forgotten. There was not only a popular constitutionalism, there was an understanding of the relationship between the Constitution and political economy. We have gotten into a very strange mode in this country, and I think this is unfortunately partially the result of the Warren Court and the New Deal, where we think of the Constitution and the court as this, insofar as it is concerned with rights and freedoms. It's about the rights of dissenting minorities, the rights of racial minorities, the rights of individuals and so forth. But if you look at Reconstruction in particular, there was a real sense that what those amendments were about was about toppling a racial oligarchy that was supported by all these oligarchic institutions in the economy, and that you need to unite a vision of political economy and the Constitution if you want to have a hope of engendering a popular constitutionalism. And one of my concerns during the Trump era was that respect the norms and these kinds of, which we don't hear that much anymore actually. But I don't think you can get very far engendering a belief in constitutionalism. I don't want to say the Constitution because it's a bit of a disaster, but in constitutionalism, if people aren't connecting it to the kinds of things that Jamelle was talking about at the beginning, about democracy, being, a form of collective self-governance, and that speaks to the concerns of everyday life. Sorry, I went on.
You've written quite a bit about the 14th Amendment, but the 13th, 14th, 15th. Do you see the Constitution as a vise, in a sense, around the anti-democratic political system? Or do you see the popular constitutionalism Corey's speaking of as something to aspire to, and how best to do that?
I think that the Constitution often is a limit to the extent of democracy in the United States because of these various structural features, because of its kind of ground level emphasis on property and the protection of private property, right? Sort of one of the reasons for the 1787 Constitutional Convention was basically elite panic at the efforts in Pennsylvania and Rhode Island and a few other states to alleviate debt for debtors, to stem speculation. A lot of the founding fathers were like degenerate gamblers, and this sort of thing. And that's really deep in the bones of the Constitution. When he was a younger man, A. Philip Randolph had this critique of the Constitution that was very much about the fact that it's so tied up in the protection of property that it may not be as useful as a tool for democratic expansion as you might think. But having said that, I mean, the interesting thing about the Reconstruction Amendments, as Foner has famously written, but as many people have noted, is that they kind of fundamentally transform the structure of what the Constitution is. And that although there are still these institutions like the Electoral College, like the Senate, bicameralism period, there are kind of strong federalism that do act as these counter-majoritarian limits, the Reconstruction Amendments, as Corey points out, are tied to this larger critique of political economy, right? The Republicans who wrote these amendments were concerned not just with ending slavery or establishing citizenship for African Americans or extending the right to vote, but with smashing what they called the slave power, which was this, this pervasive. They thought of it as a conspiracy, and I think they were wrong to think of it as a conspiracy, but this pervasive web of power and influence that enabled slaveholders to more or less control the country for the better part of 80 years. And so those amendments, because of that context, because I think they should be understood in the context of trying to establish an entirely new political order, not for nothing, the motto of the early Republican Party was free labor, free soil, free men, right? And the free labor part was important to all of this. It wasn't just a tossed off set of words. I think that the Reconstruction Amendments can thus become the basis for a more expansive vision of the Constitution. But for that to happen, as Corey points out, the Constitution cannot be simply thought of as this thing that exists in the air only to be interpreted by a bunch of wizards in robes, right? A bunch of legal elites. It needs to be understood as a document that actually belongs to the public, that actually belongs to the people, to all of the people, and to all of the public, not just founder worshipers, not just people who are like, well, you know, I believe in this strict constitution, but there are a variety of constitutional interpretations that are legitimate, that the Constitution can be understood as much more expansive than it is, and it does belong to the public at large. I think if we're thinking about democratic problems, democratic crises in the moment, one of the profound ones, I think, is the absence of any sense of real popular sovereignty, that like we aren't actually shaping the ground rules for how our society is working, how this democracy is working, and that we're governed by the dead hand of the past, as represented in this inert constitution that to get to the Supreme Court, that the current Supreme Court has reified, right? The vision of the current Supreme Court is that if a thing didn't exist in 1820, then it's obviously not legitimate, right? Like if there weren't if there weren't summer camps in 1815 where there were gun regulations, then I guess we can't have them because my seance with James Madison says that, you know, and so that beyond the absurdity of the claim is a vision of the Constitution that is unchanging, completely inert, and completely unresponsive to the people it's supposed to serve. And a phrase I will use, I'll end with a phrase that I'll use here. I grew up a church kid, and so this is like in my head, which is, right, the man was made for the Sabbath, not the Sabbath for man. And the Constitution was made to realize American self-government. We do not exist for the sake of the Constitution.
Thank you, Jamelle. Picking up on that in a way.
Actually, Lincoln gives
Lincoln
gives a version of that. He uses the silver is made for the gold, not the gold for the silver. And it's this exact same idea of the people in the Constitution. And I think it's absolutely right.
So I take away that this is a conversation about can democracy survive in the United States. Do you believe our institutions, as ossified as they are strong enough to withstand the Trumpian banging against the windows, the issues of oligarchical control, the fact that the people aren't necessarily served or heard by the institutions? And related to that, this is cable TV, but you both, I think, do not believe, Jamelle, you don't believe Trump will be indicted. And I'd be interested why you believe that and what are the repercussions in a broader or historical way.
On the, can U.S. democracy survive the, MAGA, whatever. So my view is that I don't think the threat here is that right-wing populism or whatnot is going to topple the institutions of American democracy. I don't think that's the case at all. I think, in fact, what the issue is that because it is entirely possible under these institutions to construct a pretty tight system of minority rule, as long as you get kind of the right parts, I think that a smart enough or savvy enough political movement will figure it out if it already hasn't. And it's very easy to see, right? The Supreme Court can act more or less to shoot down any kind of democratizing reforms, or even if it doesn't go that far, it can open the door to all kinds of explicitly anti-democratic moves. Its decision not to treat partisan gerrymandering as a judiciable issue is a great example of this. The court says, hey, listen, if a state wants to pull a Wisconsin and effectively make it impossible for a political opposition to win power in the legislature. Because it's on the basis of partisanship, we can't do anything about it. The case involving North Carolina maps, the independent state legislature case, if the court endorses any form of that, right, that it tremendously empowers state legislatures to seize control of election processes, completely constitutionally, right, under the rules of the game. And so it's not hard to imagine a situation where, for example, it becomes extraordinarily difficult for Democrats to win the presidency because a right-wing minority has won enough state legislatures, gerrymandered them enough that they can't really be dislodged, and then just start assigning electoral votes to whomever they choose, right? That might cause some civil unrest, but it's a thing that you can do under the rules of the system. Nothing in the rule book says a dog can't play basketball. Nothing in the rule book says that the majority of people actually have to have a say in who governs the country. And so weaponizing the counter-majoritarian institutions, treating them not as a temper on the majority will, but as a way to stymie it entirely, that I think is the most acute danger, and the danger that can only really be addressed by political reform of some sort, which, here's the problem, can only be achieved by the creation of large enough majorities and coalitions that can act at all levels of government. As for the Trump stuff, I don't think Trump is going to be indicted. I have no reason for this. I have no evidence. I have no particular insight. I just know that, like the Dukes of Hazzard boys, Trump always gets away. Always, rides the General Lee into the sunset. So I'm just kind of natively skeptical that anything is going to happen. And I'm also, I guess, just skeptical of, and this has been the case since Trump got into office, there's been this hope that Trump could be removed from the scene through non-political means, through legal means, through whatever. And I just don't think that is the case, that if Trump is ever going to no longer be a part of American political life, it is because through politics, we have removed him from the table. And to a certain extent, this isn't really the job of progressives or liberals or moderates. It's the job of Republicans. This is I think Republicans have to do. Republicans have to want to have Trump not be there anymore, and make whatever sacrifices it takes to achieve that goal. But if they don't, if they're like too afraid, too scared, Trump might call me a name or whatever, then he's just going to be here. And I don't think the legal system's going to take care of him. I have no opinion on whether he's going to get indicted. I mean, what Jamelle said sounds persuasive to me. And the larger point he's making, I think, is absolutely right. It's the political system. But I do think that, that question comes up, can our institutions survive? And I guess in a way, I think it's the wrong question. In part for the reasons that Jamelle said, which is that these are institutions that are, this is the infrastructure of the right wing. I never thought the argument that the right was anti-constitutional held much weight, because that's to, reduce the Constitution to the First Amendment and the 14th Amendment. But the Constitution is a whole apparatus of state power that serves their interests very, very well. There's a great book on Jim Crow by Robert Mickey, who's a political scientist, Paths Out of Dixie. And his point is that, authoritarianism in America has always been a subnational project, pockets of authoritarianism, and that suits their purposes, at least as they're currently constructed. So I think, again, it's the wrong question, but I would also say that the thing about democracy is that it has always come in a kind of anti-institutional form. I mean, all the great progress for democracy in this country
happened because people were willing to confront these institutions as popular movements. And even, I was thinking FDR in 1935 when the Supreme Court strikes down essentially what becomes the Wagner Act. And he's thrilled. He's like, bring it on. And he starts giving these public lectures on the Commerce Clause and how to think about it, why the court is wrong. And it's like, it's democratic politics, and people are arguing about it. And he did not take this view. I mean, I'm sure he would have been happier if the court had supported him, but there's a kind of squeamishness around these things, and the very idea that you're struggling to hold on to democracy, these institutions that are not serving democracy. I think maybe toss that idea. I mean, I'm being a little bit hyperbolic here, but and go back to a different understanding of kind of where democratic power lies in the first place.
But I wanted to say I grew up in a household where we were not permitted to call it court packing. It was the court reform program, which it's now, but there is even though the institutions are ossified, you could look at the last 70, 75 years and look at the institutional right as a mission of rolling back the New Deal, the progressive reforms, and the civilizing advances, mostly wrought by movements. So I think we're at a moment, to quote an Italian communist, and to quote him badly, the old order is dying. It's holding on fiercely. And in that time, the pathologies emerge. But where we're heading is what I wanted to ask, related to that, the rise of authoritarianism globally. How does that influence the United States? And is fascism a useful analysis for the United States? But I do also want to get you on what can be done before we turn to the audience. Jamelle, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think Americans tend to be very parochial.
Especially New Yorkers.
I have no comment on New Yorkers. I don't live here. I have no...
Charlottesville.
I live in Virginia. But Americans do tend to be very parochial, and I think it is important to look at the rise of the authoritarian right globally to see things that are connected, linkages, and so on and so forth. And I think sort of the most powerful linkage is just that the consensus of, let's say, the previous 40 years, neoliberal consensus, simply was not working in terms of generating the prosperity it promised, in terms of generating the stability it promised, in terms of generating the political order it promised. And I think you can tie the rise of the authoritarian right exactly to that, to an attempt to capture the disaffectedness and the anxieties and the anger that have been produced by the you could say failure of neoliberalism, you could say success of neoliberalism, and turn that into political energy to achieve these nationalistic, these xenophobic ends. In the United States, to be a little parochial, I think this is also tied up in just the slow but very real dissolution of traditional forms of race hierarchy. And so it's not an accident that in the wake of the civil rights movement we have this massive political realignment in the United States. It's not really an accident that the politician Donald Trump, who was able to capitalize on this collapsing order, did so using explicitly racist messaging and putting forth an explicitly racist view of what the political order should be. That some members of the community aren't real members of the community on the basis of their race or their nationality or their ethnicity. So I think that all these things are tied up together, and the global experience, whether in Europe, whether in India, whether in South America, maybe especially in South America, given both the demographic similarities, but also the political similarities to countries like Brazil. Those can help provide some insight into what is happening in our own country. Having said that, it's interesting. it's easy to be down on where we are, but also relative to some of our peers, we've done a decent-ish job of resisting the worst of it, which I think is striking, and I think does speak to the fact that at no point over the last 6 or 7 years has the populist right or the authoritarian right ever been able to claim any kind of a majority. At no point. Trump did not win a majority in 2016. Neither of the houses or senates that came with him constituted a majority of the public. Maybe the House did slightly, but the Senate didn't. Obviously, in 2020, Trump did not win a majority. That when the question is put to the public at large in the United States, that public rejects that vision. That this isn't translated into political power in every instance is kind of the problem we've been talking about.
I want to build on that last point that Jamelle just made, because I think it's a really important one. And I think if you think about the United States and the right going back to the 1960s, what's interesting to me is, in fact, the decreasing capacity of racial dog whistles and that kind of racial populism to not just win elections, but to convert it into actual political power. People forget the kinds of majorities that Richard Nixon was reelected on in 1972, Ronald Reagan a little less so in 1984, George W. Bush in 2004. And as Jamelle said, Trump never won a popular majority and single-handedly achieved something that no Republican president has been able to achieve since Herbert Hoover, which is that in one term lost the White House, the Senate, and the House. That's important information. And this is where I get uncomfortable about the comparisons with fascism, because the truth of the matter is that the whole purpose of fascism was to inject a kind of sense of popular power to a tottering regime and to restore it. And I see the tottering right, and instead of being able to rely on popular appeals, they're actually turning to that they're holding fast to that constitutional order as hard as they can, because that's the power that they have. The last thing I'll say that I think is really important is to look at actually how they governed when they had control over the entire state apparatus from 2017 to 2019. What to me was so shocking, and I get into a lot of trouble for saying this, but yet I think it's true, is how little they were able to accomplish relative to the kind of mass transformations that Reagan and Bush were able to do. I mean, the Republicans are now in control of the House. They had a 10-point plan that they ran on. A lot of the culture war stuff, they have not been able, in the House, they have not been, there's no immigration bill. This is supposed to be the centerpiece.
But maybe they don't want to govern.
I don't believe that.
You don't?
This
They're
is
not
what
a party of governing?
I don't believe that. They want, you have to believe they really want to massively restrict immigration. And yet the numbers before COVID, the numbers of immigrants was higher than it had been under Barack Obama. So, you either, Masha Gessen said, believe the autocrat. They tell you what they want, but they oftentimes cannot deliver on it. And I think that's a sign of a weakening order. It doesn't mean we're, everything's going in the right direction. But I do think, I'm probably taking Jamelle's point in maybe a direction he doesn't want me to go in, but I do think the last thing that he said is quite right, that Trump, in the end, not just lost the election, but even with everything that happened on January 6th, he is not in the White House.
Trumpism.
In the Republican Party.
Yeah.
And the truth is, Trump was elected with less of the popular vote than Mitt Romney. Less of the popular vote than Mitt Romney.
But we do have the Electoral College, so what is to be done? We have these institutions which are counter-majoritarian, anti-majoritarian, what reforms are possible? And reform is a weak word, but what changes? What can be done?
So I have thoughts on reforms, but I do want to comment really quickly on what Corey said, not to disagree, but just to kind of affirm. First, affirm the point that I agree completely that the period of unified Republican control did demonstrate like a shocking amount of weakness. The only thing they were able to accomplish was a tax cut, which is sort of the easiest thing for Republicans to accomplish, right? It's like, of course they can do a tax cut, but anything that required any more of a heavier lift, that required actual coalition building within the party, a complete wash. I'm not as down on the use of fascism to describe at least some elements of the right now. I do think that in the frustration that is very real, if you pay any attention to the platforms of the right, either intellectual or much less so, there is a real and deep frustration with the inability to acquire the kind of political power that they want to acquire. This is what all of this nonsense about wokeness and DEI, it's an attempt to find some explanation, some fittingly cultural explanation for why they can't have the power they want. But I think that in that frustration, you're seeing maybe something not fascist, but like fascish, right? That's developing and potentially taking root in like intellectual circles, and how that plays out over the medium to long term is an open question. But the sense of like frustration and loss and futility that I think breeds some of this stuff is very much there, as I think as a result of the failures of the Trump administration, which it's odd to feel like it's forgotten, but the mass protests of 2020 were taken by many conservatives to be definitive evidence that they've like lost the game.
Can I just to sort of push this a little bit further? I have a slightly opposite interpretation, which is that I think that a lot of the right, what's most significant is how much they won in their ability to push back the New Deal and their ability to reverse a lot of the gains of the Black freedom struggle. And I think the reason I resist the fascism argument is because if there was a time when that was true, it really is the kind of intense racial violence you saw in the 1960s that was so much more systemic, that was so much more targeted, that was so much more instrumental in reversing what was perceived to be not just a culture war, but a civilizational challenge to an entire ruling order. And the thing about that right is that they were successful. They achieved a lot. I mean, we talk a lot about the voting rights stuff, you know. I don't want to get too much into the Voting Rights Act, but Section 5 is the big thing that has made things so difficult. Overturning Section 5, the Supreme Court did this in the Shelby decision. The Republican Party started that process in the 1960s. You know, Gerald Ford voted along with like 149 members of the Republican Party to get rid of Section 5. So I think that's the moment where you see a synergy between popular violence and then an ability to deliver the long march through the institutions. And I think what's happening now is those two things aren't really in sync anymore in the way they are. And that's partially why it's not that I am not aware of the things that you're describing as fash-ish. To me, those are conservative-ish. That is what the right has always been about. But what it has less of a capacity to do is to bring together that kind of popular mass mobilization and elite power and put them together and make the kinds of reversals that I think they were able to achieve between the 1960s and the 1980s.
On the Electoral College, yes. Okay, to actually answer the question.
Sorry.
It was my fault.
People want to leave knowing what...
So there's the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, which is sort of like the the main idea for kind of circumventing the Electoral College without actually passing a constitutional amendment. And there's a real question about whether this is constitutional at all, because it involves like a compact between states in this way may kind of violate kind of the supremacy of the federal government in important ways. So open question whether or not you could do that. If you could do it, basically the way it would work is that if states totaling 270 electoral votes signed on to it, they would just automatically give their electoral votes to the winner of the popular vote, because there's no requirement in the Constitution for how a state allocates its electoral votes. But I think that's unlikely. I think a constitutional amendment is unlikely in the current environment, precisely because the misfires have benefited one party. No one, like very few people know this. Back in you mentioned the 68 election being very close. So 68 election, extraordinarily close. George Wallace, I think, comes within a couple thousand votes in Tennessee and throwing the entire election to the House of Representatives, which, when it almost happened, elites on both sides were like, this would be nightmarish. And so there were, Bunche, the Indiana senator, writes and introduces an amendment to end the Electoral College, and it almost passes Congress. It gets filibustered, as these things happen, by Southern segregationist senators, the worst. So that is and at the time it had like huge majority support. Had it gotten through Congress, there's a very good chance it would have actually been, we would have amended the Constitution. It's sort of the closest the country's ever come to doing it. The only other time I could imagine there'd be any appetite for it is, so in 2000, Bush becomes president because of an Electoral College misfire. In 2004, it almost happens again, right? John Kerry comes within pretty close in Ohio to winning Ohio, and thus he would have won the Electoral College and lost the popular vote. And I think in that scenario, when you have two consecutive elections with it benefiting each party, I think then you have sort of, we should just get rid of this thing. But none of that, so I don't think it's going to happen. Unfortunately, I think the only live option for doing something about the Electoral College is first assembling a political coalition that can win under the current rules, and can win under the current rules in as many places as possible. And I don't think you're ever going to abolish the Electoral College, but I do think you can begin to move towards proportional distribution of Electoral College votes, things like that, that might make misfires less likely. Or if not that, one very straightforward thing you could do is just expand the size of the House of Representatives, like add a couple hundred members. The size of the House has been capped since, 1920 something?
25, 6, but aren't there a few states where there is proportional breakdown of, very few, like Wyoming?
There's a few states where it's assigned according to congressional district, or you get like but if you were to do nothing else but add 250 members of the House, because of where they would end up, California, Texas, Illinois, New York, all the big population states, that would actually go a long way towards reducing the odds of misfires. It should also just be a good thing to do. We probably should have more than 435 House members for a country of 335 million people. If this is
if you keep one in Wyoming.
This is just, the rule that people say we should adopt is the Wyoming rule. That's sort of like Wyoming becomes the smallest congressional district size, and then you kind of, everyone has to be at least.
Your political solution, so to speak, is an interesting one. Thinking about Bunche, I was in Idaho, and the largest landmass in the lower 48th is the Frank Church River of No Return Park. No one there I spoke to remembered Frank Church. George McGovern, South Dakota. Name him from North Dakota. So, Corey, I'm sorry, do you want to? And
No,
you know
no.
who's been the most avid proponent of the national popular vote for decades is Jamie Raskin. He's fought for, but Corey, and then we'll.
I mean, I guess I think just quickly is that if there's going to be a real popular reform, I think it's going to probably, it's hard for me in today's world to imagine that kind of thing happening without a major kind of working class upsurge. We mentioned Reconstruction, we mentioned the Progressive Era, and they were eras of intense mobilization of the working classes. And I just don't see it. It's, Jamelle has laid out the institutional barriers. I think there's actually I think there's some political will in some parts, of the political class, but it's not enough. And so to me, it really is ultimately about developing that kind of popular constitutionalism in alignment with a vision of political economy. And this is what, unions historically were really, really good at. There's a reason why the right went after unions, and it wasn't just because they were threatening corporate, bottom lines, which they were, but it was a whole social order that unions were in the vanguard of creating. And I just don't really see it unless there's that kind of working class upsurge, whatever form it takes. I've been very excited about the kind of news we've been seeing, and yeah.
So I'm going to turn it to you. Questions? If you go to the mic, as Karen, I think, suggested, there's one on the left and the right, as there should be, and we can put one in the center if we can go through. And please pose to Corey or Jamelle.
Hello, my name is Baxter Speed, and I'm a master's student at the Harriman Institute for Russian, Eurasian, and Eastern European Studies. The Republican Party, at one time the poster child of American interventionism, is currently dealing with an internal crisis regarding Russia and the war in Ukraine, as Trump and DeSantis have captured an overwhelming majority of Republican voters. Both have made comments that buck decades of U.S. foreign policy objectives, and many Republicans are increasingly expressing a concerning tolerance towards measures that puts Russia into a fascist surveillance state driven by grievance politics, with the executive and judiciary doing the heavy lifting towards this. Is this fascism, as Mr. Bouie put it, in itself a threat to American democracy or a blip in the larger movement?
They're allocated.
I mean, so I'm not sure. I think that fascism is the right term to describe what's happening generally. I think that there are fascist-ish kind of elements within the contemporary right, and it's an open question about what happens with that. I do think that with DeSantis, right? DeSantis in Florida and DeSantis' decision or his moves to kind of use state authority in Florida to suppress cultural enemies, to undermine public education in an extreme way, to enrich his friends and buddies. I think that, to me, to borrow from Corey here, is very it's conservative politics in the United States. And I think that the threat is not that if DeSantis becomes president or whatnot, there's going to be, a total collapse of U.S. democracy. I think the threat is that we'll get to see just how down the rabbit hole of conservative governance you want to go, right? And that can go pretty deep. Trump is a little different because here's the thing about Trump versus DeSantis, because people kind of talk about them in the same breath, but I'm not sure you should, and here's why. DeSantis, at the end of the day, he is a Republican politician, cares about the success of the Republican Party, has majoritarian aspirations, and what he does is calibrated towards that. He wants to crush his cultural enemies, yes, but he also wants to make the Republican Party kind of majority party, which in its own way is a tempering mechanism. He'll do what he needs to do to secure advantage, but may go short of going as far as one could. Trump doesn't care about winning a majority. Trump doesn't care about majoritarianism, doesn't care about the Republican Party, doesn't care about any of it. Trump is solely about satisfying ego demands. And so this is part of the story of January 6th, right? It's precisely because he refused to accept the possibility that he could be defeated, that he basically becomes a bull in a china shop and looks for smashes everything and looks for any plausible mechanism to allow him to hold on to power. And it's that, which I'm not sure if you should describe as fascist or whatever, but I think it's that that element of Trump, which is what actually makes him like worrying in a way that other political figures might not be. Ron DeSantis, I think, terrible, the worst. I have many other more colorful adjectives I could use, but this is a family event, so I'm not. But I do think that his sort of like commitment to the Republican Party is a meaningful distinction.
Thank you.
It seems like politics, as at least I've understood it for most of my life, is unraveling, and everything is being turned upside down, which was epitomized by the congressional hearings on the Twitter files. I don't know whether you saw those, but it was the Republican members of the committee who called this hearing and called as their witnesses Matt Taibbi and Steve, I forget his last name. And the Republicans came out as the great defenders of the First Amendment, and the Democrats just ripped Matt Taibbi to shreds, and they accused him of being a so-called journalist. They accused him of how dare he make money from his journalism, and it just seemed like so amazing to me that the Republicans looked so good in that committee and the Democrats looked so bad. Anyway.
I'm sorry, I actually have nothing. I don't
Yeah,
know.
I didn't.
I didn't see it, so I couldn't comment. No.
Good evening. I'm Donald Redenberg from Baruch College. Thanks for an interesting discussion. I would quickly note that some of us miss seeing Katrina Heuvel on television as much as we used to. My question is this. Given the condition of extreme population heterogeneity in the United States, extensive and increasing, and given, if you will, the salience, the historical salience of freedom exercised as the most important United States value as opposed to equality and justice. Does that mean that if the right is willing to act in an authoritarian way, and if the left is willing to act in an authoritarian way, does that mean that democracy's survival is particularly problematic?
I'm going to answer part of your question. I'm going to take part of it. And I don't know if I understood correctly, but you were saying that I think that freedom was the sort of value as opposed to equality and justice.
Freedom emphasized because that allowed powerful institutions and individuals to act according to their self-interest, which resulted in lessened emphasis on equality and justice.
Right. I think I have a different view on that matter, which is that I actually think that freedom, Eric Foner, I think, made a very powerful argument to this extent that freedom is an extraordinarily rich and emancipatory language that encompasses equality, and that I don't think we should give that language up. Freedom has been at the heart of some of the greatest social movements in this country, and I don't think it has to be about self-interest. I think freedom is understood in its kind of most heroic moments as both collective emancipation and individual emancipation. This is what the Black freedom struggle was all about, has been all about, and developing an understanding of solidarity as the basis of a freedom struggle. So I'm not answering, where you were going with that question, but I do think that freedom is an extraordinarily powerful language, and that the left would be very unwise to give it up, particularly at a moment when, I think the right has been assailing freedom from the get-go. It has always been about creating very tight bonds of domination between individuals. And the left would be unwise at this moment when the right has extended that to things like the kind of bodily autonomy of women and so forth. I don't think it's a winning program, but more important than that, I just think there's a political vision of freedom that we ought to be that people on the left ought to be defending.
Yeah, I agree with that very much, especially since the political right does have a language of freedom that it's tied up in domination. It's the freedom to dominate, the freedom of the master, you might say. And that, if left uncontested, is attractive to some people. One of my own personal theories of Trump is that part of his political power, since he had it, was this vision of kind of like the patriarch who had dominance over his household, dominance over the business realm, dominance over the economy. And that is attractive to people. And it needs to be contested. There needs to be, from the left, a clear vision of freedom that is emancipatory, that is inclusive, that rests on bonds of solidarity and not domination between persons. And I think it would be a huge mistake to let like the right claim the language of freedom or of liberty, or even for that matter, I know, a gaggle of slaveholders, but even the founders, I think it's worth trying to make a claim on them from the basis of people articulating an ideal of freedom as opposed to domination.
Could I just say, if you wanted to continue that conversation, Corey and Eric Foner had such a conversation about freedom maybe 15 years ago at thenation.com.
We did.
And with all the flaws, go visit the Four Freedoms Park on Roosevelt Island. Sorry.
This question is about the Supreme Court as the final arbiter. Deciding what the Constitution means is actually part of the job description of every judge. And you've got one litigant saying the Constitution says I should win. The other litigant says, no, the Constitution says I should win. Case eventually makes it to the Supreme Court. They decide what the Constitution means. If they're not the final arbiter, I mean, I know Andrew Jackson had his own approach. What did he say? The Supreme Court made its decision, let them enforce it. But if we're not going to go there, how do you remove the Supreme Court from that role of being the decider of what the Constitution means?
Lincoln and the Republican Party really had to wrestle with this after Dred Scott. And I think Lincoln, handled it, really, really well and just said that the court is wrong. It was not an invitation to lawlessness. It was an invitation towards, reformation of the Constitution, which ultimately culminates in those Reconstruction amendments. But he was very clear, absolutely clear, and ran on this. I mean, he used it for the Republican Party to win in 1860. So I think we get too tripped up on that question of who's going to make the final decision. The truth is, in a democracy, it's an ongoing process, and the court gets it wrong. And again, I give you the example of FDR, and then he tried to reform the court, and the court changed its opinion about that. It happens. And
Can I sort of follow up with something? Because Obama, I think, did the same thing. Didn't he say that the court was wrong about the Shelby County? I don't know which one. But I assume from what you're saying that as a practical matter, until something happens, the decision stands. And we're going to have to follow it because we don't want to be a lawless society.
Well, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, because some of what you were saying, Mr. Robin, sounded very much to me like you were in support of the Netanyahu government proposals to be able to have the legislature overrule the Supreme Court, for example. And I just wondered if you were maybe going in that direction.
Well, I wouldn't go the Netanyahu direction, but there's certainly.
I mean, can I jump in here real quick, because I have thought about the practical part of this, like how in a political culture where the Supreme Court is not the de facto final word on what the Constitution means, like what does it actually look like in practice? I think part of what it looks like is, and this mechanism exists in the U.S. Constitution, part of it is Congress, which we haven't talked about a lot here, but Congress taking up its constitutional role as a check on the court. Like when you think about the court's position in the American political structure, it isn't above it. Right? It's in dialogue with the presidency, with the states, with the Congress. And the Constitution, most of what the court covers is in its appellate jurisdiction, and the Constitution gives like clear authority to Congress to regulate the appellate jurisdiction of the court. And so I think people should get more comfortable with the idea, for example, of if the court makes a decision that Congress believes is wrong, Congress simply passing a law saying, we're repudiating this decision. We're going to say the law now says this, and we're not going to kind of acknowledge the court's decision. Congress saying we're going to pass a law and we're going to say it's non-judiciable. The court can't actually touch it. Congress deciding maybe, this is the thing I'm a fan of, that it doesn't make any conceptual sense that 5 out of 9 people can overturn, for example, a decision that the president and the Congress and 4 other justices believe is constitutional. So we're going to raise the threshold for overturning laws from a simple majority to 6-3 or 7-2 or even unanimous decision to overturn a law. All of that falls well within the scope of Congress's power. And the thing about exercising this kind of check on the court is that it in turn can maybe make the court a little more modest about what it's able to do and what its abilities are. Cory doesn't like talk of norms, but here's a part where norms are actually important. That part of besides its structural position, part of the issue of the court is that it just like I call them wizards in robes. They do kind of just think they know better than the rest of us, and that's simply not the case. And I think that's because of the result of changes in judicial norms. It's the result of the rise, dating back to Eisenhower and to Kennedy, of judicial supremacy. The idea that the court is the final and ultimate arbiter of what the Constitution means. I think it's tied up in the actual composition of the court, not just in the personalities, but in the fact that 100 years ago, you could just be some political hack and get on the court, which doesn't sound great, but it's actually quite good, because having a governor on the court or a senator on the court is someone who's attuned to public opinion, who understands that they are in dialogue with the public, versus a bunch of, frankly, like nerds, a bunch of legal academy nerds.
It's such an important...
Who go from Yale and Harvard to Stanford to a clerkship to maybe an academic job, and then they're on the court. And what do they know?
So we're going to take one more question, but Cory and Jamelle will hang out a little bit if you want to talk.
I'll cough all over you. So
but please.
Okay, I guess this may be a sociological question, but the parts of the right are always willing to do what's necessary, whether it's Nixon interfering in '68 with peace negotiations with Vietnam, whether it's Reagan and what seems now the more probable October surprise, whether it's Trump welcoming Russian input in the election. And the left is afraid to tell the Supreme Court no. I'm going to bring this up anyway, but when Jefferson was president, they didn't like a decision. The court was told, you're not meeting for 2 years. It's very simple. You don't get to meet. You can meet, but you won't be the court meeting. You can always just abolish the circuits if you don't like the judges, and they may not even get their pay then. Or if you really want to be nasty, you can say, we're not paying you, and try and enforce it. It's perfectly illegal, but there isn't a damn thing you can do about it. And I'm wondering, why is it that the right wing has balls and the left wing is pretty cowardly?
The thing is that I hate the Democratic Party, but I want to challenge this because I hear this a lot, which is that the fact is that Biden and the Democratic Party were able to pull off a lot more in 2 years than Trump and the Republican Party were able to pull off in 2 years. There is a notion that we have, and I know where it comes from. It comes from Nixon, it comes from Reagan, and it's not just about, the skullduggery of it all. It's about the fact that these were disciplined cadres who saw their way and marched their way to power. And they had a very clear mission and a very clear sense of their enemy. And I think the truth of the matter is they don't have as clear a mission and a clear sense of their enemy. They perform it on television, but their actions speak louder than their words. Whereas I think that what you're saying, and it's nowhere far enough, and you're particularly right on the question of the court. The Democratic Party, though, or the left, is beginning to get its act together. And I'll just say one more thing about the court and obeisance to the court. Trump, every single time he was rebuffed, what did he do? He said, I'm going to sue. I'm going to take it to the Supreme Court. He was more obeisant to the Supreme Court and its authority, and he was furious when all these people that he appointed to the judiciary didn't rule his way. But the fact of the matter is that kind of, sort of litigiousness. I mean, it's an old story with Trump. I think he had fought, something thousands of lawsuits before he even became to the White House. It's his main instrument. But I do think that I think it's time that we sort of revised our sense of the right on that question that you're talking about and try to look at some of the record of what the Democrats were able to do when they had total party control for 2 years, which, again, I think was far more extensive and hopefully seeding the grounds for some kind of transformation. Biden and the Democrats have appointed more judges than Trump did at this point. I mean, there's just certain things that are happening that I think are beginning to challenge some of our received sense of the left and the right.
Yeah, it's funny. If we were in a gathering of the right wingers, and we were two conservative voices, you would, I think, hear a very similar complaint, right? Like, why can't we be as vicious as the left? The left, broadly defined, is like, Joe Biden to, right.
Bernie Sanders.
And I think that this is like a common, people on both sides perceive their opponents as being more ruthless, more willing to win than they are. And so I'm not entirely certain how far that kind of perspective takes you. To Corey's point, what I will say is that there are certainly many areas, in part because the Democratic Party isn't really like a left-wing party. It's a big moderate brokerage party, and that's what it's always been. Going back to its very beginnings, it's never really had any stable ideological foundation. Even during the FDR years, you have the Northern liberals, but you also have the Southern segregationists. You have like Midwestern moderates. You have like a big unwieldy coalition, and that itself has a lot of weaknesses inherent to it. It's fragile. It's fractious. It means that perhaps the best possible proposal on the table isn't going to be the one that makes it to the president's desk. But one of the advantages of that, and one we've seen over the last 30 years, is that it's the kind of thing that can build national majorities. And I think one of the most striking facts about American politics is simply that from 1992 to the present, the Republican Party has won the national popular vote in exactly one election, 2004. And I sort of think that some of the dysfunctions of the Republican Party are a sublimated reaction to that fact, an awareness that this is not the majority party it was in the 1980s, not the majority party it could have been in the 2000s, but something that is very much struggling to build true national support. Now, I say that in March of 2023, and who knows what happens next November, right? Maybe next November, Donald Trump is nominee, and he wins 60%, and then one of you sees me, and you're like, hey, Jamelle, and I'll happily concede to being an idiot. But at least for now, in this moment, for whatever strengths the Republican Party has, because of its ideological unity, for the most part, its ideological unity, it does have these real profound weaknesses, which have produced a whole lot of pathologies that are not conducive either to winning power in the way that it would like to, or to governing.
Secular amen. Thank you, Jamelle Bouie. Thank you, Corey Robin. Please circulate this video to your friends. Seriously, share this great video. And wisdom.